Imagine this scenario. You're running your site and it works great. You've done all the work. The design's done, everything's configured, and you're all good to go. You head on over to your ad provider and start running the ads. Everything's fine at first, then disaster strikes. As visitors start going to your site more and more, your page starts to get slower and slower and slower. Eventually, it gets to the point where your site won't load at all. So, in a rush to not lose ad money, you head on over to the ad console, click the stop button. Why did everything fail? Some of our clients have been through this issue. When you're just starting out, you'll be going to hosting providers with so-called unlimited bandwidth. Based on all of the research you may have done, this sounds like they will allow as many visitors to your site as you could possibly get. Unfortunately, that's not quite how all this works. While the bandwidth itself may be unmetered, what's more important is how your server is configured. If you're receiving a lot of visitors at the same time, you not only need to be concerned with the amount of data you can use, but the number of visitors that your hosting can handle at the same time. A lot of hosting providers don't mention this since it's just not relevant to the majority of their users. Here's where the issue is coming from. Most of the providers will be using a web server program called Apache. Especially if you're running WordPress as the backend of your site, this is by far the most popular software for hosting websites. The problem is that by default, Apache can only handle 150 simultaneous connections. To be clear, this doesn't mean 150 simultaneous visitors. This means connections, and most browsers will initiate 2 to 3 connections at a time. In general, web pages are made up of a bunch of different files. In order to show the page, your server has to provide all of these, not just your website's main HTML. So, while the individual HTML page may load in under a second, if all of the images, CSS, JavaScript, etc. take 5 seconds to load, this means that 2 connections will be taken out for the entire 5 seconds. The end result is that you're limited to around 50 to 100 simultaneous visitors at any one time. If your site is really fast, this may not be an issue, but if you've made it to this video, chances are this is already a problem. There are a few direct solutions to this. You could just increase the Apache connection limit, but depending on your hosting provider, this may not even be possible. If it is possible, then you have to worry about resource usage. The more simultaneous connections your server is configured to handle, the more resources your server will need in order to run all of them. The big limit here is cost. If you're solely trying to run your hosting on Apache, your hosting costs may skyrocket with the large amounts of traffic. A big store with many products, especially if your site is inefficient, could easily reach the limits of your server. This could end up using a large server just to handle a few hundred visitors at the same time. This is especially true when your site is running WordPress with a plugin like WooCommerce. Another solution is extensive caching. Decreasing the resource-intensive traffic will get around this issue. If you don't have to constantly keep generating the same page over and over again, the load on your server will be significantly less. There are a number of ways to handle this caching. The ideal is when you have a server like Nginx that can handle thousands of simultaneous requests. Basically, a properly configured Nginx server will save a copy of your site. When a visitor goes to your site, instead of constantly querying your Apache server and database asking what page to serve, it will simply provide the saved file. This is how large sites can end up having entire page load times under 2 seconds with thousands of visitors. It's all about optimizing the resources you have and how you can use them. The problem is that this kind of setup can be rather complicated to configure yourself. At Potent Pages, we have spent years trying to eliminate all of these sorts of issues. The config files for a server can end up being thousands of lines long, and it can become a mess unless you know exactly what you're doing. There are providers that offer similar services. The problem with these is that they tend to cost a pretty penny. Generally, you're looking at around $100 to $200 per site minimum. There are some sub $100 providers that will offer a similar type of service. The problem with these though is that usually the cost is indirectly based on the number of visitors. So if you're trying to handle a large quantity of visitors, you're still going to have to pay for more traffic regardless of what happens. WP Engine is arguably the most popular of these. If you're in this position and need help, please feel free to contact us. We are used to helping clients that have gone from hosting to hosting only to find that none of them work very well. By the time people come to us, they're usually in a position where their sites are getting enough traffic that these providers just aren't going to work. We've provided a link to this video's notes in the description down below.